John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism. Maximise happiness. That's a caricature of utilitarianism, but it does capture something true and central to the theory. John Stuart Mill is the most famous utilitarian philosopher, and in his book Utilitarianism, he develops and refines the cruder version of the theory which had been put forward by his mentor, Jeremy Bentham. In order to understand Mill's approach, it's important to see how it differs from Bentham's. Bentham's utilitarianism. For Bentham, the morally right action in any circumstances is the one that will tend to maximise total happiness. He conceives of happiness as a blissful mental state, pleasure and the absence of pain. The more of this pleasure that occurs in the world, the better. It doesn't matter how the pleasure is produced. Bentham famously declared that pushpin, a pub game, was as worthwhile as poetry, provided that they produced equal amounts of pleasure. Each individual counts equally in the calculation of how much pleasure is produced by an action, and the total of pleasurable states is summed to determine how we should act. This is utilitarianism in its most straightforward form. So, for instance, if a utilitarian wanted to decide whether to leave her money to one poor relative or divide it between 20 reasonably well-off friends, she would calculate how much total pleasure would be produced by each. Although the inheritance might make the poor relative very happy, the total amount of happiness may still be less than making 20 reasonably well-off friends moderately happy. If this were true, the woman should leave the money to the friends rather than the relative. Mill shared many of Bentham's beliefs. Mill's greatest happiness principle, for example, is simply actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, and both were hedonists in the sense that their approach to ethics was founded upon the pursuit of pleasure, not, however, merely the pursuit of individuals' own pleasure, but rather the pursuit of the greatest overall pleasure. Actions, for both philosophers, were to be judged according to their probable consequences, not according to any religious code or set of binding principles to be followed whatever consequences ensued. The phrase, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is sometimes used to describe the utilitarian approach to ethics, but this can be misleading. What both Bentham and Mill were interested in was achieving the greatest aggregate happiness. That's the largest total sum of happiness, irrespective of how that happiness was distributed. It would be consistent with this approach to think that it would be better to make a few people extremely happy than to make a much larger number slightly happier, provided that the sum of happiness in the first case was larger than the sum in the second. Where Mill's utilitarianism differs from Bentham's is that he gives a more sophisticated account of happiness. For Mill, there are qualitatively different sorts of pleasure, higher and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures are to be preferred to lower ones. Bentham, in contrast, treats all pleasures as on a par. Mill on the higher and lower pleasures. One common criticism of simple versions of utilitarianism such as Bentham's is that they reduce the subtleties of human life to a stark calculation of animal-like pleasures with no concern for how these pleasures are produced. Utilitarianism of this kind was ridiculed as a doctrine only worthy of swine. Mill answers such criticisms with his distinction between higher and lower pleasures. As he puts it, it's better to be a dissatisfied human being than a satisfied pig, and better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied fool. Human beings are capable of intellectual pleasures as well as the brute physical ones. Pigs can't have intellectual pleasures. Mill argues that the intellectual pleasures, those he calls higher pleasures, are more valuable than the physical lower ones. His argument in support of this is that those who have felt both kinds of pleasure will certainly prefer the intellectual kind. This leaves him with the awkward fact that some people who are capable of experiencing sublime intellectual pleasures nevertheless throw themselves into lives of debauchery and sensual gratification. His response to this sort of case is that they are led astray by the temptation of immediate sensual reward, but they still know well that the higher pleasures are more worthwhile. The so-called proof of utilitarianism. The obvious question to ask is, why maximise happiness? Mill's answer is controversial, though it's important to realise that he never claims that it produces a conclusive justification for his theory. He doesn't believe that a theory such as utilitarianism can be proved to be true. Happiness, he says, is pursued as an end in itself. the ultimate end of all human activity is happiness and the avoidance of pain. Everything else which is desirable because it contributes to such a life. If you spend your life collecting beautiful works of art, this activity is a way of getting pleasure. If someone, for example, argues against Mill by claiming that they pursue virtue as an end in itself, independently of any happiness that might arise from it, Mill answers that virtue then is an ingredient in their happy life. It becomes part of that person's happiness. The greatest happiness principle claims that the end or purpose of all human life is happiness and the avoidance of pain. These are the only things that are desirable as ends. Everything else desirable is desirable as a means to these ends. So the question, why maximize happiness, is really just a question about what makes happiness desirable. Mill gives an analogy to answer this question. The only way that we can prove that an object is visible is by showing that people actually can see it. Analogously, he claims, the only evidence we can give that happiness is desirable is that people actually do desire it. Each person finds his or her own happiness desirable, so general happiness is the sum of the individual happiness, and itself desirable. Criticisms of utilitarianism. The proof, so-called, is based on bad arguments. Mill's attempt to justify the belief that we ought to maximize happiness contains some allegedly bad arguments. Most of these were pointed out by Henry Sidgwick. First, the move from what is visible to what is desirable is misleading. Mill suggests that because we can tell what is visible by identifying what is seen, it follows that we can tell what is desirable by identifying what people actually do desire. But on closer inspection, the analogy between visible and desirable doesn't hold. Visible means can be seen, but desirable doesn't usually mean can be desired. What it usually means is should be desired or is worthy of being desired, and that's certainly the sense in which Mill employs it in his argument. Once this weakness of the analogy between the two words has been pointed out, it's difficult to see how describing what people actually do desire is likely to reveal anything about what people should desire. But even if Mill had established that happiness is desirable in the appropriate sense, this would lead logically to a form of egoism, each person pursuing his or her own happiness, rather than the more benevolent approach of utilitarianism, which makes the greatest happiness possible its aim. Mill thinks that because each individual wants his or own happiness, the total of all individual happinesses can simply be added up to give an aggregate which would then itself be desirable. But this doesn't follow at all. He needs a far stronger argument to prove that the general happiness, rather than just our own individual happiness, is something that we all ought to pursue. Difficulties of calculation. Even if Mill had established that there were good grounds for adopting a utilitarian approach to ethics, there are still some objections to the theory and its application which he would need to meet. One practical difficulty is that of calculating which of the many possible actions is most likely to produce the most happiness overall. This can be a particularly vexing issue if you have to make a moral decision quickly. For instance, if you're faced with a dilemma about who to save from a burning building, given that you can only save one person and there are 3 trapped inside. In such a situation, you just don't have time to sit down and calculate probable consequences. Mill's response to this sort of objection was that throughout human history, people have been learning from their experience about the probable courses of different sorts of action. The solution is to come up with some general principles about which sorts of actions tend to maximize happiness, rather than to go back to the greatest happiness principle whenever you're faced with a moral decision. Mill suggests that the rational approach to life involves adopting such general principles rather than forever calculating possible consequences. So his utilitarianism has 2 stages. First, the derivation of general principles on utilitarian grounds, and then the application of those principles to particular cases. Higher and lower pleasures. Mill's division of pleasures into 2 categories creates problems of several sorts. Because these pleasures are different in kind rather than just degree, it makes the calculation and comparison of consequences of actions far more complex. Higher and lower pleasures are incommensurable. That is, there is no common currency in which both can be measured and compared. So it's not at all clear how we're to apply Mill's version of utilitarianism in circumstances where both higher and lower pleasures enter into the calculation. Furthermore, the higher-lower pleasure distinction looks like a self-serving one. It's not really a surprise to find an intellectual defending the idea that intellectual activity produces pleasures of a far more satisfying kind than merely physical ones. This in itself doesn't prove the theory false, it just reveals the fact that Mill might have had a vested interest in the intellectual pleasures being intrinsically more valuable than the others. Unpalatable consequences. The strict application of utilitarian principles in some cases has consequences which many people would find unacceptable. For example, if there'd been a gruesome murder and the police had found a suspect who they knew hadn't committed the murder, there might be utilitarian grounds for framing him and punishing him accordingly. Presumably most members of the public would be very happy that the culprit had been caught and punished. They'd remain happy just as long as no one found out that he was in fact innocent. The innocent man's suffering would be great for him, but in the calculation of consequences would be far outweighed by the sum of pleasure that many millions of people would feel at seeing what they believed to be justice to have been done. Yet this consequence of utilitarian morality would be unpalatable for most of us. Our intuitions are surely that punishing the innocent is unjust and shouldn't be permitted whatever the beneficial consequences of this practice might be. One response to this sort of criticism is to modify utilitarianism into what is known as rule utilitarianism. Here general principles are worked out on utilitarian grounds, such as that in general punishing innocent people produces more unhappiness than happiness. These general principles or rules are then adhered to even in the few particular cases in which, for example, punishing an innocent person would in fact produce the greatest sum of happiness possible. Some have claimed that Mill is actually himself a rule utilitarian. However, it's more plausible that what Mill says about working out general guidelines before you're faced with a situation in which you must act quickly, rather than doing calculations on the spot, is only intended to produce rules of thumb, that is, generalizations which can be broken in particular cases and aren't binding principles of conduct.